The Planning Commission special meeting of November 15, 2023 is now called to order. And I'll call the roll. Vice Chair Raspy. Here. Commissioner Hanson.
Here.
Commissioner Thomas.
Here.
Commissioner Burnett.
Here.
And Commissioner Jenna.
Here.
Thank you. And I am here as well. And I am going to lead the Pledge of Allegiance today. If you'll all stand up. Haven't done it in a year. Join me, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So under verbal communications, we're having the public speak only on our agenda item 1 tonight. And in which we're asked to consider and make a recommendation to the Town Council on the draft revised 2023-2031 housing element. Location is townwide. General plan amendment application is GP-22-003. And we'll start with a request from staff for a presentation. Thank you.
Yes, good evening. The primary purpose of this item this evening is to ask questions of staff and the town's housing consultant, Veronica Tam, who is available on Zoom this evening, on the revised draft housing element that was submitted to HCD on October 2nd. And then also to discuss potential modifications based on the preliminary feedback that was provided by the town's HCD reviewer and provided in the addendum report. In parallel with this discussion this evening, town staff and the consultant continue to work on implementing the modifications based on the preliminary draft comments and matrix that also was provided in the addendum. Staff expects to have the draft revised housing element and additional modifications completed for a future special planning commission, which at that time the planning commission will review, deliberate and make recommendations to town council on whether to adopt the draft revised housing element with additional modifications. As required by Assembly Bill 215, the draft revised housing element must be available to the public for a 7-day review period prior to resubmittal to HCD. Staff does expect this 7-day period to start on Friday, November 17th, and it will run through Monday, November 27th. Town expects to receive a comment letter from HCD on the draft revised housing element on December 1st. This completes staff's presentation. We are available for questions, and as I stated, the town's housing consultant, Veronica Tam, is available for questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Walters. And I wanted to commence the meeting by thanking the staff and the consultant for their very hard work on this difficult project. And I'm going to begin by asking staff to provide us some guidance regarding the method of proceeding with the meeting tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Chair. So as presented by the project planner, the intent of this evening's meeting really is going to be to discuss the housing element, ask questions of staff and the consultant, hear public comment on the current draft. But because we did receive those preliminary comments from HCD last week and are in the process of putting together some revisions in response, we do recommend that today's discussion really be a discussion and asking questions, that a future meeting would be the time then to go through how the town is responding to each of those questions one at a time. So it wouldn't necessarily be the organized kind of topic by topic discussion that, for example, the HEB has had in the past when we were looking at responses to comments from the state. Hopefully that is helpful for understanding the purpose of the meeting, but we'd be happy to answer any more questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions by commissioners at this time of staff? Go ahead, please. Melanie Hanson.
Commissioner Hanson. But
Commissioner Hanson, indeed.
I understand that we're supposed to be talking about the topics in the housing element, but I did have a general question about timing. And I did read the letter that we received from the town attorney trying to explain those whole timing thing. So I understand HCD is going to respond formally on December 1st, and that this is sort of an evolving document in that that you already met with them in a preliminary review. You're making some changes, but they're going to issue their full review on December 1st. So I'm just trying to understand what the urgency is of the Planning Commission meeting again on the 29th, when it's 2 days later, that we would know exactly where we stand with HCD in terms of their view versus doing it after.
Okay. Thank you for that question. So the direction that staff has been given is to try and make sure that the housing element is available to town council as soon as possible for them to consider it. And one of the things that is required prior to that is for the Planning Commission to make a recommendation. So what the thought of behind staff's recommendation that the second special meeting of the Planning Commission be on the 29th is that we will have, with the assistance of our consultant, prepared responses to these preliminary kind of interim comments. And so as you could see in that chart, a lot of the previous comments have already been addressed. And so this has given us a kind of interim option to respond to the remaining outstanding issues as identified by the preliminary comments. So our goal is to be able to provide you with a revised draft that is substantially in conformance and fully responding to those outstanding issues, while also giving you an opportunity to make a recommendation that town council can then review. If there were significant additional comments that were still outstanding, it might be that we would return to Planning Commission to review another draft if needed. This goal really was just to move it forward as quickly as we could.
So, can I, if I may have a follow-up question? So staff feels confident that with the revisions that you're making, that we should be largely there.
Correct.
When we meet again on the 29th.
Yes.
Otherwise, we will push it out. So I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, Chair, one more follow-up question. So playing devil's advocate on this, back in January, the Planning Commission, made a recommendation to adopt the housing element as it stood then. And so what are we doing on top of that, since we've already made a recommendation to adopt it? What are we doing now? Adopting this version of it? Or I just would like to just clearly understand the timeline.
Right. Thank you. So the discussion tonight will be of the current draft, but we would be coming back recommending that the Planning Commission consider and make a recommendation on a slightly revised draft in the hope that that gets it very close to whatever the final version that the state says can be certified. And so it may be that the town attorney has something to add to that as well.
It's very similar, but just ultimately we're looking for a recommendation to the town council to adopt an amended housing element. And so in a nutshell, that's what staff is recommending.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. So it's the amended housing element. Okay.
Other questions at this time from commissioners? Otherwise, we'll open the public portion of the meeting and ask if members of the public wish to speak on agenda item 1 for up to 3 minutes. I don't have any cards, but you're welcome to come forward, please.
My name is Jim Zanardi. I've been a resident in Los Gatos my whole life, 74 years. And I have just a couple of questions. According to what I've read, the town of Los Gatos is above the state requirements in the arena numbers of 1993 and the buffer of 15%. Right now, we are 2,700 units with a buffer of 57%. Councilman Hudis in November, he brought up a question about removing 322 units, Alberta Way, Los Gatos Lodge, etc., from the inventory. By removing these sites in Los Gatos, we'd bring our buffer down from 57 to 48%. It looks like to me we could even remove more sites. The fact is we can always add additional sites. Therefore, why add more units now for our town to bear? Once you put them on, you can't take them off. Why not put them on as you need them? That's common sense that says, why not do that? Second question is, a big concern is environmental studies for any additional sites. Will this be done? Now, what I've been reading is California has been losing 250 to 350,000 people a year leaving the state. What are we doing building so many houses throughout the state? It doesn't make any sense. Common sense would say we don't need the housing. What are we going to do? Sell them to the homeless? I don't think so. They're not going to be able to afford any of these. So who's going to be in these houses? And people are leaving the state. Doesn't make any sense. None. Zero. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Let's see if any commissioners have questions for you. I am not seeing any. Thank you for coming down and presenting your comments. Ms. Quintana, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Before I ask my question, or before I make a statement, I want to ask the question that since there's going to be new information provided at the next Planning Commission meeting, will the public be able to comment even if they've commented today?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. The only comment I'm going to make today is based on the question of, is it better to have an oversupply of identified sites or eliminate sites and then in the end probably have to add sites? The question I have is that if sites need to be added, does that mean that the whole process of going through HDC is initiated again? Or if we have sufficient buffer sites, then that process will not be necessary and it will be a faster, smoother process overall.
Thank you for those comments. Ms. Quintana.
Nobody's going to answer them.
So,
can I just add
I'm
that I would like staff to answer that question, or through the commission answer that question now?
I think that's appropriate, and maybe we can answer Mr. Zapparelli's question as well. Mr. Zanardi, excuse me.
We're going to wait till the housing consultant rejoins us on Zoom to answer that question.
And when is that expected?
It looks like there may be some issues with Zoom with things connecting, so she is working to reconnect. She dropped off for a moment, so.
And through the chair, we might as well see if there are any other public comments, and then we can close the public hearing and come back to answer those questions.
All right, so does anyone who's present here wish to be heard on the agenda item number 1? I don't see anything. Do we have anyone on Zoom?
Thank you, Chair. If you're interested in speaking on this item, please raise your hand if you're on Zoom. There are no hands raised, Chair.
Thank you. So I'll now invite discussion by the commissioners on agenda item number 1. keeping in mind staff's suggestion as to the scope of our remarks. And we'll begin with someone who raises their hand first. Commissioner Thomas.
I think that we can start with one of the questions from the first speaker, and that was just like an overview of what types of projects will require environmental review per CEQA. Someone on staff can probably help us out with that.
I'm happy to jump in.
Thank you.
And on that question. So right now we have the housing element. These sites have been in the housing element for months. We're not proposing to remove sites for future projects. Most of these projects are by right projects because they were either in the previous housing element and or they required rezoning, which has been done by town council. The adoption will be next week. So those will be by right. We can still do architecture and site review, but because they're by right, they generally will not require CEQA. Additionally, the number of units that were studied in the general plan EIR far exceeds the number of units in this study. And I'll jump in to Ms. Quintana's question as well. I think the goal is to get the housing element certified. Once we get to the no net loss issues that we envision down the road, then those sites do have to be approved by HCD. We would use the same methodology for the sites that are currently in the housing element. And if any environmental study is necessary at that time, we'll make that determination.
I might add, if you could comment on the indication that the buffer is in the range of 50% rather than the 15%.
Yes, thank you. So the current surplus is 58%. Given the comments that we received from our preliminary review from the reviewer from HCD, we envision that a number of those units are going to be removed, either because of additional information provided by a reviewer that indicates we may not be able to count them, and or from a timing perspective, the analysis for some of those units may take far longer, and it's going to be quicker and more expeditious to just remove those units and still maintain the buffer. But the buffer will ultimately be less than it is currently, is what we're currently envisioning. And we'll know that for sure by Friday.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Hanson.
Follow-up question on what was just discussed. So when we originally put together the site inventory, the site inventory was intended to be approximately 15% over the buffer. And then there was another version where we added a couple of sites. So we were at about, I want to say around 25% buffer. And then the new consultant came in. This is I'm just recounting my recollection. There's a question in here. The consultant came in and we were able to count some sites that we didn't know. Is it those sites that might be coming back out or sites that are actually in the original site inventory?
Thank you for the question. So yes, we envision that the majority of, if not all of those permitted and titled sites, which was approximately 250, I believe, most, if not all of those will be removed because we're still doing the research, but we think the majority of those have already been reported to the Department of Finance, which is a trigger that our reviewer brought up that was not brought up before.
Thank you.
Still waiting for the consultant?
No, we do now have Veronica Tan available if there are questions from the commission.
Okay, so Commissioner Hanson.
Something that I've been wondering all along, and we've, three of us have been on the housing element the whole time, is about this AFFH. And the lion's share of the preliminary comments were on AFFH. And if I'm reading the matrix that came in the addendum, it looks like they're still saying no on a few of the items, even after we had root policy research do a lot of additional analysis, and we reviewed it at the Housing Element Advisory Report, and it clearly was much more detail than was originally provided, but now they're still saying no on some of these items. So I'm just trying to understand where are we really on this? And is there some standard that we can hold up to that we know about? Because it seems like they keep pushing back and asking for more details. Is my question making sense? I'm looking for, like, where's the end of this? Because you can do an infinite amount of analysis on the trends, and they do make some references in here about, what are we going to do in reaction to that? But does it ever end that we're in compliance with AFFH? Like, where does it end?
Thank you for that question. I think that is going to be a great first one for our consultant, Veronica Tam, to speak on, to talk about how those outstanding comments maybe are different, or what remains on those comments, and what we anticipate doing to respond.
Thank you, and I apologize. I was having some computer problems, so I wasn't able to hear the whole conversation. I was able to have video, but not audio. But my understanding is that certainly the town is concerned that there's iterations of changes, and this is actually a pretty common process that most jurisdictions has to take in order to get the housing elements through. But I think based on the preliminary comments that we just got from HCD last week, the additional changes are pretty technical in nature. And I think with the revisions that we had planned and done so far, I think will get us very, very close to the housing element certification. Now, certainly we cannot guarantee it, but I would say that, based on my experience and having worked on probably close to 60 housing elements so far in the 6th cycle, that yours is very close to getting there. And I think that's what's indicated to us by the state as well. What is likely going to happen is that when we resubmit the revisions to the state by the end of the week, they would be able to incorporate the majority of the revisions that we have made and dismiss most of the concerns. It may have some remnants of comments that we would see on December 1st, and when we get the letter, that would maybe give us a little bit of time before we go to council adoption and to make the revisions at that time. But I think you are probably 95% there.
Did that answer your question?
Could you comment specifically on the AFFH? Because I understand what you're saying about the overall process, but the AFFH, I mean, since you've worked on 60, housing elements in the state, which is quite a bit, and we appreciate you doing all this for us. Could you comment specifically on the AFFH comments? Because this is a new law that we didn't have the last time in the 5th cycle.
Right. And, yeah, and I think so far the state has looked at the analysis already, and they have provided additional comments, mostly in the area of local knowledge. The state doesn't want us to just primarily rely on data, statistics to talk about the town's fair housing issues, but mostly we have to supplement that with local knowledge. And my team, Jamie, has been working on that as well with city staff to kind of get more about the character, the history, and the constraints that the town may have regarding to housing. Now, the other topic that they want us to beef up on, I believe, is the racially concentrated areas of affluence, because you are a fairly higher income community, and this is also very typical when we work with ABAC communities. There are some fairly high income communities that we deal with, and we do have to go through all of that discussions as well. I think generally what's important to the state is make sure that you have a range of sites that are distributed throughout the town, and that you have actions to address existing kind of like this kind of gaps or discrepancies among neighborhoods. And again, we are working on like making that more that kind of response more prominent. You do have a lot of actions and programs within your housing element that have beneficial impacts to fair housing, but it's kind of distributed throughout the housing element plan section. So we are creating, as part of the response to the state's comments, we're creating a matrix that shows exactly which housing element actions would respond to fair housing and would have like beneficial impacts. And I think, you know, a lot of, like I said, a lot of your housing policies and programs do have beneficial impacts. They're just not labeled as fair housing programs. So what we're trying to do is bring the kind of like provide a summary, a matrix of all the actions. I think once we've done that, it would be more clear to the state that how the city is responding with fair housing.
So do you think that we, at this stage, we've gone far enough to comply with AFFH in our housing element? I mean,
I think so.
Other than present, you know, I hear what you're saying, you know, taking the individual programs and tying things together, because it seemed like what they're looking for was, what are you going to do about it? You know, and since we do have all those implementation programs, but do you feel like we do have the kind of implementation programs that will ultimately satisfy them if you can just put it in front of them in the right way?
I think so. I would say that we're almost there. I'm not. Yeah, I can't guarantee that you are there yet, particularly with AFFH, because that is an area that the state is very, very picky about. But I think based on our assessment, you're really close to getting there. But in the next couple of weeks, or maybe before the council adoption, that's where we're going to probably have to do a little bit of negotiation with the state. Is like what we think is realistic, what we can do, because we also have to make sure that what the state is asking is realistic, that can happen in the town, that is implementable. So I think there is maybe some back and forth still on the AFFH, but I think we're very close to getting there.
Okay, thank you.
I have a follow-up question on that. In the matrix under AFFH, HCD requires specific information regarding the town's response to the requirement, and the answer provided by the town was work is in progress by the staff and the consultant to determine if additional analysis is required. That would result in programs to provide stronger housing elements. So I was concerned about the word, you know, if it's required or not. It seemed to be questioning the recommendation by HCD, excuse me. If you understand my question.
From the preliminary comments we got, it's not so much about a lot of additional analysis. There is the additional analysis that they did ask for is the RCAA, racially concentrated areas of affluence, and also on local knowledge. If Jamie is online, maybe she can comment about the additional analysis that you have done.
No, unfortunately, she is not on the Zoom meeting with us this evening.
Oh, okay. My apology. I thought she is, but oh, you know what? She is actually in another meeting. So yeah, but no, I think the comments of the preliminary comments that we got is not so much about a lot of extra analysis. I think we want to make sure that we present our case the best in terms of our meaningful actions, and that's why we're developing this matrix that would correlate issues and programmatic actions that maybe people would not label that as housing, fair housing programs or actions, but they really do have beneficial impacts.
I see. Okay, thank you. Other questions? I'm not seeing any. Commissioner Burnett.
Yes, I have a question, and thank you for answering our questions tonight. So I have a question about the ADUs. What is the basis for increasing the very low income distribution for ADU to 30% when the ABAG Housing Technical Assistance Team actually in September of 2021 reported an affordability of ADUs recommended jurisdictions with fair housing concerns, which Los Gatos does have, to use more conservative assumptions? Because I noticed our numbers are fairly high, considering we should really maybe be only at like 5%. Anyway, much lower numbers than are showing in our report.
Well, I think in general, what we are trying to do is in fact promote all ADUs, like more ADUs in areas that have opportunities for it, which is higher resource area, low density area. I think one of them, I think in the future, one of the actions probably is going to try to get how ADUs to be more affordable, more available to lower income households. That's part of the actions that we talked about in promoting use of housing choice vouchers, and promoting the whole idea about renting ADUs to lower income households. So I think that is the goal is to actually make ADUs more affordable to lower income and moderate income households. I think that's the reason why we switched it.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Commissioner Hanson?
So I had a couple questions about the matrix relative to the site inventory. So I'm just going by, I'm trying to think if there's what page it is on page five of mine. The first one was about the realistic capacity, and they were saying, no, their preliminary review said we're not there. And so that seems to be a pretty big deal to me. Then I looked at their notes. It says program BH must clarify by right definition for reuse sites. It says in staff response that program AS identifies the reuse sites, but work is in progress by staff and the consultants to include the definition of by right development in program AS. So is that something that's going to be submitted this week or soon? Because that seems like it's pretty material to them being satisfied that our site inventory is developable.
Thank you for the question. So that is part of the work that staff is going to be working on and preparing to have go out for the 7-day review starting on Friday. Okay,
thank you. And then on SB9, I don't know if I totally understood it, but it looked like they were looking for specific sites. This is on page 7. And do we even know? I mean, I think that's it's still pretty new, and I think there's education going on. Do we even know? Because I don't know that we have any sites in the site inventory for SB9. So what would we do in terms of identifying specific sites?
Yes, thank you for the question. Initially, we provided how we're calculating the SB9 numbers, but we do not have specific sites that are evaluated. Some communities do have that. The town does not. So that is something staff is currently reviewing based on this comment.
So we're still trying to decide how to respond?
So yeah, we are finalizing that. One of the discussions that we have had is that the way that SB9 was presented in this current draft is more aligned with the ADUs, where we aren't identifying specific locations of where future ADUs are, but that the estimate for number of new housing units is based on past trends. And so we looked at the number of SB 9 permits that have come in since that ordinance was in place and justified there, as well as additional justification that was prepared by Veronica Tam's team that put together an analysis of what sites were available in town that met certain criteria. And based on past practice, our understanding was that that was going to be acceptable to HCD. What this preliminary comment indicates is that it may be that they're not willing to accept that alternative, that they want an analysis that's more like our sites inventory, where we're identifying specific sites. And so we will be looking to see how critical those unit numbers are for the overall sites inventory calculation, buffer, et cetera, and looking to see, what at this point, to expedite this and keep it moving forward, the best course is going to be.
Okay, so a follow-up question. My understanding was that what was done in the most recent submission that you had the preliminary review from is that it was basically a funnel, which made a lot of sense to me. There was actually, when I went to the Planning Commissioners Academy a year ago in 2022, one of the consultants to the state had done basically a funnel, and they looked at all the housing in the state and what could possibly be feasible and what was financially feasible. And so they came up with what was a very low percentage of the total. And I thought that was kind of the direction we were going. And now I'm hearing that HCD's actually wanting you to treat it like site inventory. So, and then what I heard you say as a follow-up, if I heard it correctly, is that we might be taking those sites out.
Through the chair. So Joel Paulson, Community Development Director. So yes, so this current version that was submitted in October did have kind of that funnel of looking at a parcel size that's reasonable for 2 units, looking at all the parcels in town that would allow SB 9 that fit in that bucket, and then paring that down even farther to what I think I recall is less than 1% of those parcels. And so that's been a method that has been accepted elsewhere previously. But as we're finding, as our region has gone through the process, things that might have been accepted in Southern California are not being accepted any longer. So we're weighing how quickly we could do that type of analysis. And if we can't do it quickly enough, and if we have enough buffer, then it's just simpler for us to remove those units from the numbers.
Okay, that makes sense, but it sounds it is a little bit scary in the sense that we're hopefully close to being done, but then that's 96 units, but we do have more buffer, so I'm sure you guys will figure that out. But that seems like a bit of a red flag for me, especially since I believe it came from one of our council members to make sure we included SB 9 sites since that law was put in place.
Is there any comment from staff before I take Commissioner Janos' question?
It looks like the consultant has some additional comments.
Yes, I just want to kind of emphasize that it is not uncommon that even HCD would recommend an approach like that, as because we are close to getting a certified housing element, but we're not removing the opportunity of SB 9. SB 9 is still being discussed as in the housing element. It's still an opportunity for sites, particularly for moderate and above moderate income type of housing, because SB 9 is not likely going to generate units that are lower income. It's still in the housing element. It's still an opportunity that the city will continue to pursue. It's just not being used to count towards the RENA for adequate site purposes. But when you do build units, you do have SB 9 applications process, you do get credits against the RENA. Getting sites, adequate sites analysis is a little bit different than getting credits for RENA for accomplishments. So you will get accomplishments when you do have SB 9 applications processed.
Mr. Janoff.
Thank you.
And thank you for that clarification, Ms. Tam. That was very, very important. I think when staff said we'll be taking sites off the inventory to expedite the process, you know, it kind of makes us pause a bit. But this makes very, very good sense. If the hurdle to get these sites on the inventory with the type of analysis that's been done is prohibitive in terms of the amount of time, and we've got the buffer, take them off. That's a very, very simple and elegant solution. So thank you for that clarification.
It's listed in one of the exhibits.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Raspy, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed one of the open issues on our matrix is the story pole discussion, and I know Planning Commission had a lengthy hearing on that and provided our comments up to Town Council. I was just curious as to where we are in that process and if we believe it's going to be resolved in time for this element to get certified. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I can provide an update. So we are currently scheduled to go back to Town Council on December 5th for them to continue that discussion. However, based on the discussion that was held by Town Council on August 1st, we have been able to draft some additional language for the housing element to give more specificity about the motions that were made and approved by a majority of Town Council. So we've been able to add that in and draft some language that describes some of the changes that have already been approved by Town Council so that it can provide clarity to the state that that work is already ongoing and that some motions have already been approved by Town Council for changes.
Thank you so much for that answer.
Maybe I'll jump in with a question. In my review of the matrix, it appeared to me that the most recent HCD comments were bringing up new material rather than delving further into prior answers. Do you have any sense of that?
For many years now, because of the passage of a state ordinance for certain findings have to be made.
So I can jump in and then we might see if Veronica has something more to add. When we look at the list of comments, these are actually the comments from our last letter. And then there's an additional column that talks about which ones have been resolved and which have not. It appears that almost half of them are marked as resolved, that the work that's been done is already enough, and that it's just there's some more that's needed to fully resolve the remaining, I believe it's 16 items. Yeah, 16 items on this chart. So there are some cases where they're asking for more detail than we thought was needed to resolve the question, but that was one of the benefits of this preliminary conversation in the middle of our 60-day review, that we could touch the base with them and find out where we needed to go further.
And through the chair, as we noted in the staff responses, we tried to add where we addressed these comments in previous, in the current version. I think this is a pattern that we've seen with all of their letters. We provide information and then they come back and say they want additional information or additional analysis. So I think this is just a continuation of that, and we're hopeful that we're going to get over the hurdle this round.
Okay, so my layman's analysis that HCD was bringing up new issues doesn't seem to be founded. They're just narrowing down trying to get the additional information to satisfy previous inquiries.
That's correct. As Ms. Armour mentioned, these are the comments from May that we're addressing.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Hanson.
Can I ask, I may come back and ask additional questions on the matrix, but can I ask a procedural question? Since we've been at this several rounds, when we actually get a letter from HCD, will it say that we're done, or are they still going to have lingering questions? I mean, what would be normal when we are actually done with... Would it be done but or done?
Thank you for that question. And we might actually see if Veronica Tam might tell kind of what those look like for the other communities she's worked for. But my understanding is the goal is done, but most likely there will be a few more back and forth, as she was mentioning earlier. There may be a little bit of negotiation that needs to be done to really close it out.
Goal is to get to a letter by December 1st that it would say, if adopted as revised, the housing element would comply with state law, and especially actually remind me, if we are doing the rezoning soon, or there's no rezoning that needs to be done later on. But if there's any kind of rezoning that needs to be done, then it needs to be, then we'll let her say, the housing element will be found to be compliant once the rezoning is done. I would say that you will have on December 1st letter, you will still have some remnants of comments. But I'm confident that with the revisions that we're doing right now, we should be able to dismiss the majority of the 16 items. The other few items is really a negotiation. It's the art of a review that gives the reviewing of authority to do that type of back and forth. And I think we may have to do a little bit of back and forth, but I think with the revisions that we are working on, we should be able to dismiss the majority of the comments, because most of them are technical in nature that shouldn't have a lot of negotiation.
Thank you.
Commissioner Janoff?
Thank you. Could you clarify what that negotiation is? Is that a conversation between you, staff, and HCD saying, no, really, it's in there, or could you explain what negotiation means?
And I'll give you some examples, and hopefully that's not going to be too frustrating for jurisdictions. And I go through this all the time, but there will be sometimes, and our goal is to do like 50 units and affordable units in over 8 years or something for a small community. And the city may come back and say, yeah, we think that you can do a little higher. And so we'll kind of move back and forth and say, realistically, we think, we can push it up to 80, but that's all we can do. So that's that kind of quote unquote negotiation. Is not so much about, I think that's the type of things that we should be expecting.
If I may. So are you saying that these negotiations happen verbally back and forth, or is this a letter to us and a letter back? And I'm curious about.
It would be verbally doing our like what we try to do also is every time before and after we submit a draft to the state, we would have a meeting with the state, and we talked about what they're looking for, ask them to clarify what exactly are they looking for. And we had that meeting just recently, I think a couple of days ago, and just to kind of clarify what they're looking for. And so I think after we resubmit, and I don't think we would have an opportunity, given the holidays next week, that we would have the opportunity to have a meeting with them. But if possible, we should try to get a meeting with them before they issue the letter. But even after they issue the letter, we would arrange a meeting to just go over what the remnants of comments and what expectations they have. I think, definitely the state is in a position of pushing higher. We are, holding our grounds to see what we can do realistically as well.
Thank you.
Commissioner Thomas.
And just as a follow-up, that is when you're referring to we, you are referring to yourself and some town staff, or is it just your office that will do those negotiations?
It would not be just me, because I work for you.
Thank you.
So, but the town staff is certainly taking the lead, and I'm there to facilitate the discussions. And sometimes I know where they're coming from, and I have, I understand a little bit more about where they're coming from, and maybe between the lines, what they're asking. So I'm trying to kind of facilitate that discussions, but definitely staff take the lead because only staff understands the resources and the constraints that the town is facing.
Okay, perfect. And then I do have another additional question. So I do think that we had a couple of other questions through public comment that it would be helpful for us to just discuss. And I know some of us have sat on the Housing Element Advisory Board for a while, so we're a little bit familiar with this, but can someone, either town staff or Ms. Tam, can you explain why why the site inventory looks as it does with the buffer? I know we kind of covered this already, but in addition to that, why is it important to include all of these sites to get it passed versus adding sites later down the road? And then if sites do need to be added, how does that work?
Thank you for the question. So there have been no changes to the sites inventory. We have not added or removed sites. The discussion of the surplus increasing really is coming from this new bucket of these entitled, finaled, or permitted units that we didn't previously include in the January version that was adopted. So that's approximately 250 units. So when you add those additional units, that's resulted in the increased surplus. It's not because the town has added any new sites to the sites inventory. So we did receive preliminary feedback in this matrix from 8CD about those additional 250 units. And so that's part of the work we're doing this week to review and see if those units have in fact already been reported to the Department of Finance, which in case they would be removed and the surplus would be decreased.
Follow up?
Yeah.
Please.
So I think that it's clear why that percentage changed, but from the beginning, from day one, we've had just a lot of comments from the public and concern about the number of sites included and the total number of units. So I was just hoping we as a group could very briefly go over, not go over them, but go over the importance of why we need to have all of these sites on our initial list instead of adding more as we go, which I know we've discussed, but I think that it needs to be addressed again.
And through the chair, maybe Ms. Tam can respond a little differently to, should we be removing sites at this point? Obviously, this has been predominantly the same as what was adopted in January, so there hasn't been a change. There has been many comments when we went up to the 25% buffer of concern, but ultimately that was adopted. So that's where we're at. The other bucket that was added, again, has been discussed, but Ms. Tam, if you would maybe provide comments on, what implications there might be if we if the Planning Commission ultimately wanted to recommend removing some of the existing sites.
Sure. Well, for one thing, there is, I think everybody has heard enough about this, is SB 166 monitoring of no net loss, which is a new state law that applies to the 6 cycle housing element, that anytime when you cite a site in your inventory is developed, if it's developed with fewer units than projected in the housing element, or fewer affordable units like by the income distribution, you have to do an accounting of whether the remaining site inventory has the ability to meet the RHNA. Because of your town, the market economics, the majority of the housing element sites, when they're developed, they're not likely going to be developed with a lot of affordable units. Probably just your inclusionary requirements, that type of projects. But for the purpose of doing adequate site analysis, though, the state does allow us to use density as a proxy so that we are allowed to count most of the sites that are higher density as housing sites that are feasible for facilitating lower income. So when actual development happens, you're likely going to have a net loss against your site's inventory. So for that reason, the state recommends a buffer between 15 to 30% of a buffer. That's in the site inventory guidebook provided by HCD. The higher income area, the more expensive communities, I think the higher the buffer should be, because it's more likely that you're going to result in a net loss of affordable units when your sites are being built. Now, can you remove sites right now? I certainly do not recommend it, because removing the sites, meaning that we have to completely redo the AFFH analysis. At the end of the AFFH analysis, there is an analysis of how your site's inventory is distributed across different neighborhoods, across different demographics and characteristics in your community, and therefore conclude whether the sites are promoting fair housing. So if you choose to reduce sites right now, we will have to redo the AFFH analysis, and that would substantially delay the whole housing element certification process, because HCD would need to review that whole section again. Now, when you run into a net loss situation in the future, it only gives you 6 months to actually identify replacement sites or rezone additional sites to replenish your site's inventory. So having a high enough buffer today would save you trouble as you go down the line, because we all know rezoning and identifying new sites is not an easy task. State law only gives you 180 days to do that. So having a healthy buffer is going to take you a long way when your sites are eventually developed.
And through the chair, I would add also that since council has already introduced all but one site for the housing element overlay zone, we certainly wouldn't want to be looking at reducing any of those sites.
Mr. Thomas?
So my next question was about if that rezoning and the taking out of that one space is going to impact our housing element at all, or the certification process of it, and what, if so, how can we remedy that?
Thank you for the question. So because it's only 16 units in the housing element and they're all above moderate, it's not going to have an impact like a parcel or number of parcels that also include affordable housing as a part of that. So we have looked at that because that is a potential option as well, to bringing that buffer down, or that surplus down that slight bit more.
So then is that site still going to stay in, but just at the current zoning, or will it get removed because it's not getting rezoned at this point?
Well, I would say that is unknown, and it's really a timing issue, because actually that one site is going back to the council on December 5th. So in between there, we're looking at options to for when we come back on the 29th, if planning commissioners are available, to potentially, there's an option to remove that site, but also to include language in any resolution or future action that, because it was in before, should the council choose to rezone that site in the interim in the timing that would accomplish certification, then we could always add that back without having to come back through a full cycle with the commission.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Henson.
Since it was asked in the public comments, I thought we should bring this up, and because it's also come up in other meetings as well. The out-migration from California to other states that started picking up during the pandemic and hasn't really changed much. Has it had any impact at all on the states and HCD's interest in pursuing all this AFFH? Has it had any tampering of following through on everything that we're being asked to do?
Thank you for that question. This is a topic that, and a question and concern that was brought up actually enough years back that it was part of the general plan update process, that there were these news articles and discussion of this. And there are different studies on what these numbers are, but at this point it is not changing what the requirements for the state are in terms of the housing capacity that communities need to provide in their housing element.
Thank you.
I have one question, Ms. Tam, and that is, I gather you've found HCD to be very responsive in terms of time on these iterations, and you expect that to continue to be the case. I assume that they're overwhelmed, but it sounds like you're managing. Can you comment on that?
They are definitely overwhelmed, and I think they are also understaffed. I think that's probably a fair comment. And so they do have statutory deadlines to make. And so a lot of times if we want to push them to respond faster, then sometimes it's actually do formal submittal, because then they're bound by a statutory deadline and or review timeline for you. I do try to engage them in an informal kind of review first, and to the extent that I can get them to commit to responding faster through informal review, I do try to do that. But informal reviews do have run the risk of they're not obligated to respond in a timely manner for informal review. So I think at this stage, we want to do formal reviews. That's why we submitted it for the 60-day review, and we're getting a letter. At this stage, the state is also starting their review of housing elements in the Monterey Bay and also in the San Joaquin Valley areas. And so I think we run the risk of being pushed behind the line if we don't commit them to a statutory required time frame. So at this time, I do recommend going through everything formal review, but we all try to have interim conversations with the state during the formal time frame.
So would it be fair to say that you're in agreement with the staff in terms of the probable timing for Planning Commission review and council review?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Burnett.
Yes, thank you. Question for staff. A follow-up question then, what would be the most likely timeline for the certification of the housing element if it didn't happen on December 1st?
Thank you for that question. So as was laid out in the staff report, our recommendation is that you continue this discussion until November 29th. And to add to what I was saying earlier with a little specificity, if we want to allow time for the town council to consider the housing element before the end of the year, their final meeting is on December 19th. And the deadlines for putting an ad in the paper for this item to go to that meeting is actually on the 30th of November. And so that's why the 29th is a critical date in that timeline. And we do need to include wording in that ad that reflects what the recommendation from Planning Commission was. So that's how we got to that timeline. The hope, based on the description that Ms. Tam has shared as well, is that once we have that meeting with Planning Commission and you've provided a recommendation based on the additional changes, we then get a formal letter on that Friday, December 1st, from the state. We hope that at that point, either all of the comments have been resolved or it is only a few minor issues, and so that any remaining revisions that need to be done are minor enough that they don't need to come back to Planning Commission, that your recommendation can stand and can be brought to Town Council on the 19th, along with any additional feedback based on the comment letter for December 1st.
Thank you for those comments. Helpful. I'm not seeing any hands raised. I don't have any more questions. So why don't we move on to the issue of the continuance and see if there's a motion for continuance of this hearing to November 29, 2023 at 7 o'clock. Commissioner Thomas?
I'm happy to do that, but I do have a clarification question for staff. Is that going, so that's going to be another special meeting on the 29th?
That is correct,
Okay.
because it's not a regularly scheduled date for Planning Commission.
Okay, so I move to continue this item to a date certain, is that what I'm supposed to say? On November 29th, a special meeting at 7 o'clock p.m.
Is there a second? Commissioner Henson?
I second the motion.
I assume there's no discussion, so I'll call for a raise of hands of those commissioners in favor. And that's unanimous. Thank you very much. And I believe we're ready to adjourn.
Thank you, Chair. Yes.
So again, thank you all for your participation tonight from the members of the public and our consultant and staff, and I'll call the meeting adjourned.